In the isolated village of Hollowmere, nestled between jagged cliffs and a perpetually fog-choked forest, the nights have always been unnaturally dark. The village's only defense against the oppressive blackness is a scattering of old, flickering street lights, their sodium glow casting feeble pools of orange light along the dirt paths. For generations, the villagers have relied on these lights, not just for safety, but for a fragile sense of normalcy in a place where the sun seems reluctant to rise. But over the past week, something has changed. The streetlights have begun to fail one by one, each night plunging Hollowmere deeper into shadow, and with every outage, someone disappears. It starts with Old Man Harrow, the village recluse. His light, the farthest from the center of town, flickers out on Monday night during a storm. By morning, his shack is empty, no sign of a struggle, no footprints in the mud, just his rocking chair creaking on the porch. The villagers whisper about wild animals or a runaway, but they replace the bulb anyway. Tuesday night, the next light dies. Mrs. Calloway's, near the well. She's gone too, her knitting needles still stabbed into a half-finished scarf. By Wednesday, the pattern is undeniable. The darkness isn't just swallowing the light, it's taking them. Our protagonist, Ilara, is a young woman who's lived in Hollowmere her whole life. She's practical, skeptical of the old superstitions her grandmother used to mutter about, tales of a living night that feeds on fear and flesh. But as the outages creep closer to her little cottage on the edge of town, Ilara can't ignore the dread gnawing at her. She notices things, the way the shadows seem to stretch longer than they should, the way the air grows thick and heavy when the last light dims, and the faint, guttural hum she swears she hears just beyond the glow. On Thursday night, she watches from her window as the streetlight 2 houses down sputters and dies. The next morning, the Miller family, 4 of them, are gone, their dog whining in the yard. By Friday, panic grips Hollowmere. The remaining villagers gather in the church, the only building with a generator, its weak light barely holding the dark at bay. Theories fly: electrical failure, a prank, a serial killer. But Ilara's mind keeps circling back to her grandmother's stories. She digs through an old trunk and finds a brittle journal, its pages filled with spidery handwriting. It speaks of a pact made centuries ago. The village founders traded their safety for a boundary of light, a barrier to keep the nightmare at bay. But the pact came with a warning: neglect the lights, and the nightmare wakes. Ilara realizes the village has grown complacent. No one's maintained the lights properly in years, bulbs unreplaced, wires frayed. She convinces a few brave souls to help her repair the remaining streetlights. But as they work under the fading dusk, the darkness presses in. It's not just absence of light anymore. It moves, curling like smoke, brushing against their skin with icy fingers. One man, Tobin, panics and drops his ladder, running into the black. His scream cuts off abruptly, and the dark pulses, thicker now. By Saturday night, Ilara is alone. The others have fled or been taken, and the final streetlight, hers, begins to flicker. She barricades herself inside, piling every lamp, candle, and flashlight she owns around her. The hum grows louder, a chorus of whispers now, promising rest if she just lets go. The windows rattle as the dark seeps through cracks, snuffing out candles one by one. Her flashlight dims, and the last bulb in her ceiling lamp buzzes faintly. In a desperate bid, she grabs the journal and reads aloud a scratched-out incantation her grandmother had written. a plea to renew the pact. The words burn her throat, and the light flares briefly, blindingly bright. When morning comes, the village is silent. The street lights hum again, everyone restored. But Alara knows it's temporary. The nightmare is awake now, and she's its keeper, bound to tend the lights forever or watch Hollowmere vanish into the dark.
Lydia Crane had always found solace in her garden. Tucked behind her crumbling Victorian home in the sleepy town of Ashwick, it was her sanctuary. A tangle of roses, lavender, and herbs she tended with quiet devotion. She'd inherited the house from her late aunt, a reclusive woman who'd left no explanations, only a key and a note: keep the soil fed. Lydia assumed it meant composting. That was until the day she found the bone. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, poking out of the dirt near her marigolds. A slender, ivory shard, no bigger than her pinky. She brushed it off as a bird's remains and tossed it aside, but the next morning, it was back, half buried in the same spot. Curious, she dug deeper. Her trowel clinked against another bone, then another, each one larger, etched with faint, spiraling symbols that shimmered when the light hit them just right. By dusk, she'd unearthed a dozen, ranging from delicate slivers to a curved piece that might have been a rib. She told herself it was an old animal graveyard, but the carvings unsettled her. They weren't random. They felt like a language. That night, Lydia woke to footsteps crunching outside her window. She peered into the garden, but the moon was hidden, and the shadows were too thick to see. The sound circled the house, slow and deliberate, then stopped. In the morning, her roses, once vibrant red, had twisted into gnarled gray stalks, their petals scattered like ash. She blamed frost, though the air was warm. Digging again, she found more bones, deeper now, some as long as her forearm. The symbols glowed faintly in the dusk, and she swore they pulsed when her fingers brushed them. By the third night, the footsteps returned, louder, closer. She locked the doors, but the garden seemed to hum, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. Peeking out, she saw her lavender swaying, though there was no wind, and the soil shifting, as if something beneath was stirring. Her flashlight caught a glimpse of a shape, tall, skeletal, woven from her plant's twisted stems, before it sank back into the earth. Panic gripped her, but so did obsession. She had to know what the bones meant. Lydia spent hours researching, finding nothing on the symbols until she stumbled across an old Ashwick legend in a dusty library book. It spoke of a gardener's pact, a ritual to bless the land with endless growth, sealed by burying offerings deep in the soil. But the offerings weren't grain or blood. They were bones, carved with oaths to bind something ancient to the earth. Her aunt must have known. The note, "Keep the soil fed," wasn't about compost. It was a warning. On the fifth night, the garden erupted. Vines snapped through the dirt, coiling into grotesque, humanoid forms. Arms of thorns, legs of roots, faces hollow and eyeless. They lurched toward the house, dragging clumps of soil studded with glowing bones. Lydia barricaded herself inside, clutching a kitchen knife, but the windows shattered under their weight. The air filled with a dry, whispering chant, the symbols' language spilling from the creatures' jagged mouths. She realized too late, the pact demanded a keeper. Her aunt had fed the garden with her own silence, her isolation. Now it wanted Lydia. In a final act, she grabbed the largest bone, a femur, and snapped it. The creatures froze, then collapsed into dust, the garden falling still. But as dawn broke, Lydia saw new sprouts curling from the soil, their tips bone white. The pact wasn't broken, it was waiting. She'd feted her fear, and now the garden owned her.